In the US, big polluters will get free rein. Will we let that be the case in Canada too? Strong climate policies like the emissions cap can spur green innovation and can force companies to reinvest in innovation here in Canada rather than elsewhere, creating greener local jobs in the process. A corporate emissions cap could also save thousands of Canadian lives and billions in health costs from ambient air pollution reductions alone without factoring in climate benefits. In fact, oil and gas production can meet historical highs under an emissions cap. That's even according to the PBO. Offshore oil operators would even be able to make money selling carbon credits under an emissions cap to more polluting projects in the rest of the country. And green job growth will more than offset any reduced growth in oil and gas. Oil and gas demand is set to peak this decade. We need to grow a green economy now before it's too late. Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and today we're going to be talking about why the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report on emissions cap that was released this week was deeply flawed. And by way of talking about this specific report, we are also going to chat about why reporting on the economics of climate policy in general needs to improve and how it can improve. An emissions cap, for anyone not in the know, is a proposed regulation that would limit the amount of pollution wealthy oil and gas corporations in Canada would be allowed to emit. It's important because oil and gas corporations are Canada's worst polluters, emitting 30% of our national emissions while being only 5% of our economy. The emissions cap is also an important policy because it's a policy wildfire and flood survivors in Canada have been calling for. People have lost homes and even whole communities to climate impacts. We have some previous episodes on the emissions cap if you'd like to learn more, including an interview with climate impact survivors who are calling for the emissions cap. This episode, however, is going to be very short. It's an update-style episode on a recent news story. Please stay tuned as we will have longer episodes coming soon on a number of different subjects. Also, before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us. The Parliamentary Budget Officer report on the emissions cap, which I'll refer to as the PBO report from here on, is out, and we will go over what it says and outline its flaws in a moment. But first, I think it's important to talk about why a policy like the emissions cap is so important, and why policies like it can help us define ourselves and build our economy in a time when our sovereignty is being threatened by the United States. Right now in the US, decades of progress in minimizing corporate pollution is being undone. Ultra-rich corporations in the US are being given free rein to pollute as much as they like. Canada can and must be different. Not just for moral reasons, but for practical and economic reasons too. If we want to trade more with partners in Europe, they're going to care about our climate progress, for instance. That's why strong climate policies like the emissions cap can spur green innovation and can force companies to reinvest in innovation here in Canada rather than elsewhere, creating greener local jobs in the process. A corporate emissions cap could also save thousands of Canadian lives and billions in health costs from ambient air pollution reductions alone without factoring in climate benefits. We are making progress, and we must protect what we love. That was the central message wildfire, storm, and flooding impact survivors from across Canada brought to Canadian officials in Ottawa when they advocated for an emissions cap. Again, you can find out more about that in our previous episode. So let's chat about the PBO analysis of the emissions cap, and once again, that's Parliamentary Budget Officer. We've spoken in the past how, no matter what people's views on oil and gas expansion, we can all support an emissions cap on Canada's most polluting corporations. In fact, oil and gas production can meet historical highs under an emissions cap. That's even according to the PBO. But corporations would need to meet the bare minimum emissions reductions on site in the process. That's the point of the emissions cap. Offshore oil operators would even be able to make money selling carbon credits under an emissions cap to more polluting projects in the rest of the country. Because again, this is a cap on pollution, not a cap on production. Again, it's important to note that oil and gas corporations, while only 5% of Canada's economy, are Canada's most polluting sector, and they do cause around 30% of national emissions. Between 1990 and 2022, emissions from oil sands production grew by 467%, and conventional oil production by 24%. Since 2005, emissions overall increased 11%. Per barrel emissions from oil sands also increased since 2018. Meanwhile, other sectors and individual Canadians cut their emissions. These corporations have failed repeatedly to carry out simple measures that would help them meet their own emissions reduction targets, let alone meeting the higher general Canadian emissions reduction target that the rest of us are held to. This week, the Parliamentary Budget Officer released a report on the costs of the emissions cap, but not any of the benefits. And oil and gas lobbyists have been quick to try and cherry pick findings from that report to attack the emissions cap. The report itself is not the first report on climate policy by the PBO to have been based on a problematic analysis. The PBO did a similar analysis of carbon pricing, which turned out to be highly problematic because they had conflated the consumer and industrial carbon prices. And the last time this happened, when the PBO finally made corrections to that climate policy report, they did so in a way that went unnoticed for weeks, something which has eroded a lot of trust in that institution. And faulty premises also exist in this PBO emissions cap report, which skew the results against the emissions cap, as pointed out by the Pembina Institute. Number one, the PBO assumes that virtually no further action is taken to reduce non-methane emissions in the next few years by corporations, which does not match what oil and gas corporations have promised to do. Those corporations have sought out and received large amounts of taxpayer funding to cut emissions. They are now being promised even more money, which is why we need an emissions cap to make sure they actually follow through on those promises. As the National Observer writes, billions of taxpayer dollars have been tabled to help companies cut carbon pollution, using technology like carbon capture. But a PBO's analysis assumes the industry will not take advantage of government incentives. The second point about why this particular PBO report is flawed is that, as CBC writes, the PBO does not factor in the cost of climate change and its impact on the GDP. It also does not consider the jobs that could result from decarbonizing the oil and gas sector and other sectors. That's a huge problem because, again, the whole point of climate policy is to create jobs of the future while preventing damaging pollution. And green job growth will more than offset any reduced growth in oil and gas. Think about it this way. This is as if somebody had done a report on the cost to the economy of requiring seatbelts in cars, but had done that report without accounting for any of the benefits of having seatbelts in cars. Yeah, the automotive industry does have to spend more to put seatbelts in, but nobody denies it's a good thing in terms of lives saved and reduced healthcare costs. Another analogy might be a historical study of diminishing job growth in the horse-drawn carriage industry due to the rise of cars, but without factoring in the increased job growth as a result of car production. And that leads to some final big takeaways. Firstly, the emissions cap will not see anyone fired from the oil and gas industry, but it will grow green jobs in a world where oil and gas demand is set to peak this decade. Even the PBO's faulty report only says that less jobs would be created in the oil and gas sector under an extreme scenario of oil and gas growth, not that people would lose jobs. And that's an important difference, because that extreme scenario simply will never happen. There will be no massive GDP hit from the emissions cap either, for the same reason that demand is set to peak for oil and gas. The emissions cap is exactly the sort of climate policy Canada needs if we want to encourage local investment in Canada and differentiate ourselves from the US. Unlike the US, Canada should send a message that the biggest polluters should pull the same weight as the rest of us, and that's exactly what this emissions cap does. It makes them do exactly the same work as other people. In fact, they get more leeway to do less. We need to grow a green economy now before it's too late. Even under the flawed assumptions of the PBO report, the resulting findings show one thing. Oil and gas advocates' claims that the emissions cap would cut Canada's current oil and gas production or prevent growth are false. Whether or not you agree with expansion, that's an important factual point. One of the things that differentiates Canada and the US is that we aim to hold big polluters responsible. We may not agree on how to do that at times, but that central call for climate responsibility is a core part to what has defined Canada as a country in recent years. And we have made progress, even if oil and gas corporations have held us back. Let's not lose that progress. Experience shows oil and gas lobbyists do not care about you and do not care about Canada. They sadly only appear to care about profits for the very few. Do check out previous episodes for more information and remember to spread the word on issues like this. Before we end today, a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.